If you only ever take one piece of advice about redrafting your screenplay, let it be this. In life, not every problem can be fixed, but sometimes, in screenwriting, your problems can fix each other. Okay, so let me give you an example. About a year ago, I wrote a TV pilot, about a 60-page long murder mystery. In my first draft, I created a bunch of these different threads, thinking at some point I'll figure out some creative way to have it all tie together. So, in the first 3 pages of my script, I have a character, her name is Esme Leroux. She's a French policewoman who is traveling to America to investigate the murder of her younger sister. And in the first scene, I show her packing her purse. And so I'm able to have a few different items that she places into the purse be character pieces in different ways. Objects that will immediately tell the audience a little bit about this person. So some of those things I ended up finding ways to tie back into the script. You know, for example, in this kind of story, it's sort of like a Chekhov's gun, where, you know, Chekhov's gun is the idea that in a movie, if you show a gun, it needs to be fired before the end of the movie. Otherwise, why are you showing the gun? Typically, it'll be done where a character is rifling through someone's belongings, and they'll open up a drawer, and there's a gun in that drawer. Now imagine you're watching a movie or a TV show, and something like that is introduced. And a character opens the drawer, and there's a gun inside. And then they quietly close the drawer. And then it's never shown again, never mentioned again. No matter how good the rest of that movie or TV series is, you're always going to go, wait, why'd they do that? Why'd they show the gun? What was the purpose? Why did the camera need to get a close-up of this item if that item is never used again, let alone used in an important way to the plot? So, a few of the items that I had this character put into her purse tell the story of who she is and help inform the plot and story moving forward. However, there was one thing in her bag that was just kind of random. I had her put in a chocolate bar.
Chocolate? Did you say chocolate?
And I don't know why. I don't know anything about Europe. I don't know French people. But something about that just seemed right. This French woman who's kind of a hard-edged character, suddenly having a sweet tooth meant that she was more relatable, more likable, and that was the only reason that I had her put a chocolate bar into her purse. So the script takes place primarily at a hotel, and so I'm creating these threads of characters in the hotel who could potentially be suspects in the murder, or could potentially be victims or witnesses, etc. In this hotel, I had characters who are only there for the weekend. I have characters who are kind of hanging around, even though they don't necessarily have a room at the hotel, which makes them very suspicious. And then I thought it would be interesting to also have a few characters who live at the hotel long term. So I had one of these characters be a guy who seems like the obvious main suspect. He's just kind of creeping around the whole time. And I think ultimately I ended up revealing that he's like a PI or someone who's also there on behalf of a missing girl. So it kind of throws you off thinking that this guy is the villain, when in fact he's also on the same journey as Esme. And then I had another character who's a woman who I thought, just to add a little more conflict, it's a woman who is very reclusive. She lives at the hotel just because it happens to be cheaper than other options for her. And she has this little annoying yappy dog. And I thought, that's another nice piece. You know, we're in this hotel, we're trying to create conflict here and there. To have this dog that's not supposed to be there, and the woman who's running the hotel knows that this lady, this guest, has her dog, but she can't prove it, so she still has to be friendly to her, and oh, how's everything going? Meanwhile, she's getting all these complaints about this woman clearly having this annoying little yappy Pomeranian dog, whatever. And then I had several other little threads like that were just kind of there in the script. It's not hurting, but it's sort of almost a Chekhov's gun, where it makes the viewer go, this is going to come back at some point. And then if the episode ends of this pilot and none of that comes back, they are going to feel cheated in some way. So what I do in that scenario, in my later drafts, is I'll just start writing down every single thing that I kind of want to do something with. The first thing that I'll do is see if I can connect any of these dots. If I can take this random moment in the script and this random moment in the script and find a way to have them connect to each other, you've solved 2 problems at once, in the most creative way possible that also seems as though it was planned from the beginning. And that's how you solve a problem correctly, because if you're really careful and you're really creative, you will start to see these obvious patterns that will end up actually shocking you, that you didn't think of it to begin with because it seems so obvious. Are there any of these individual threads that aren't really doing enough for this story right now that could connect together like two pieces of a puzzle? And suddenly, it hit me. And if my audience is as smart as I believe you to be, you may have already figured out what I did. We have two things in this script that on their own are not doing anything. You have a character who's walking through the halls trying to solve a murder, and I want different things to be getting in her way. You have a dog causing a nuisance in the hotel, and you have an item in a purse that doesn't seem to be doing anything for the story. And what was that item again? Oh yeah, a chocolate bar.
Chocolate! 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 Chocolate!
Esme LaRue is walking through the halls of the hotel. You talk about killing a pet one time. Chill out. Okay. Alright. So, what I did was I had Esme eating her chocolate bar. She's in the hall. She's sneaking up on a door. She's trying to hear what's happening inside. And suddenly, this little dog that has escaped their owner comes out into the hallway and starts yapping incessantly. So Esme thinks, I need to get this dog to stop making all this noise. What do? I know, I'll just give it a treat. I'll give it some food to shut it up. So, of course, she gives it the chocolate bar. And then later in the script, the dog is found dead, and now you have antagonistic forces created out of thin air, where this woman at the hotel who's staying there now has ample reason to not like our main character. So things are becoming more and more complicated in the script, and it all comes from two random threads that I came up with separately that I had no intention of tying together. I have another example from another script. It's another murder mystery. I had the script pretty much figured out, but I just couldn't figure out who this killer should be. And at first I had this whole backstory for that they were connected in some way, and it's this nice twist where someone she thinks she's close to is actually this killer who's been stalking her all along. Eventually I hit this moment where I thought it's so obvious that it's crazy that that wasn't the impetus of the script in the first place. So when you're able to solve it, and I can't really give away more than that because it is the twist ending of this script, which I hope to sell soon. And I can give dozens of examples of times that I've been able to do something like that in my script. I wonder if I have that sheet. I don't really want to show you guys this because, like I said, this is a script I'm actively pitching right now. Yeah, whatever. You guys aren't going to tell anyone. Okay. So, this is what I'm talking about. I wrote these 4 different things here that I felt like could be improved in the script. And I found a way to connect 2 of them to each other, 1 of them to 3 of them, and 1 of them to 2 of them. And now suddenly these 4 individual threads that weren't doing anything for me in this script all feel like they are one connective tissue that holds the entire story together. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but more often than not, I'm telling you, this is the way to go. To a lot of people, writing the first draft of a script seems impossible. And if you've never written a screenplay, writing 100 pages of a story from scratch might seem like an impossible feat. But ultimately what you will find is that the first draft is a piece of cake. Theoretically, I can write a first draft of a screenplay in 2 or 3 days. I've done it a few times. I think the most pages of a script I've ever written in a day is 57. I think it was in my script Blood Orange, I want to say. But yeah, you can write enormous quantities of a first draft in a day because it's called the vomit draft for a reason. The idea is just to get your ideas out onto paper as fast as possible so that you can then mold it into a true piece of art. I mean, you want to look at your screenplay the same way that a great artist looks at a cube of ice or marble. You need to be able to visualize that final product inside, and you need to get really good at seeing that your marble statue still has a chunk on it that needs to be removed. It's significantly harder with a screenplay. If you're a sculptor and you're trying to make a statue of David, if the whole thing is more or less perfect, but there's one chunk of marble left right here, and there's one chunk of marble left right here, and maybe his nose is too big, and maybe his is a human size, and you want to make sure it's shriveled, all those things are obvious when it's so clearly visual. With a story, a lot of that stuff is far less obvious, which is why you don't have one draft, and why you don't have two drafts, but why often you'll have many drafts. Now, the other day we were just talking about the Simpsons movie. The Simpsons movie, I believe, probably has the most drafts of any individual screenplay in the history of Hollywood. And the reason is that it's such enormous IP, intellectual property, that that studio, Fox, was never going to allow anything subpar to come out other than 20 years of television.
Stop! He's already dead!
So what they did was they spent about 100 drafts just trying to nail down the basic story of the script. Because of course, you know, with The Simpsons, you could have gone in so many different directions. And you will find that some stories will require more drafts than others. Sometimes your first draft will be really solid, and sometimes your first draft will be really terrible. I've written over 50 feature scripts in my life. One of the last 10 that I wrote, I would say, is worse than the previous 20 or 30. And it's just because I wasn't prepared enough to go into that first draft. And it's a more clear plate of vomit than some of my other projects. Whereas I have other scripts that the first draft looks like a third or fourth draft, and then it really just takes a polish to get it to a solid place. Alternatively, I have a script that I've done 17 drafts of. I've spent probably 3,000 hours just working on improving that script. And the reason for that is that I was planning on directing that movie. So it's a little different when you are the sole creator. I'm currently in the redrafting process of a script that I'm co-writing with a gentleman by the name of Connor Susi, very talented writer-director. You can find his movie Dead Whisper on Amazon and Apple right now. The music score was done by my good friend Nikhil Kopaker, who is the composer for Wheel of Time. You may recognize his most recent track, The Hills of Tanchico. So Connor and I are developing this script. Often I'll write alone, so it was a bit of a learning experience for both of us to figure out what our style was for collaborating, and that can be its own video. But the point is, we're on probably the 6th or 7th draft at this point. I mean, it could be argued that it's only a 5th draft or whatever, but at a certain point, you start to make these changes, and then it's, all right, that's another draft, that's another draft. I can tell you that if you read the first draft that we wrote, and then read the most recent draft we wrote, we probably replaced 70% of the content of the script from the first draft to the 4th or 5th. And that final 30% is fairly similar to how it was in the first draft, but almost all of the actual dialogue in those scenes has changed. And a lot of the focus, thematically, has changed. Now, the ideal scenario when you're writing your first draft would be that you heavily outline your idea. You get a really solid concept of what you want to do with the story, and then you do the note card method of putting a scene on each note card. You have about 100 of them. That's when you kind of figure out the correct structuring of your script. That's the smart way to do it, because the more you pay attention in your outline, and the more work and effort and time you put into before you write your first draft, the fewer drafts you will probably have to write. So if you're not someone who wants to go back and have to excavate their own project until they can find the nugget that should have been the main focus in the first place, damn it. Anyway, I don't know whatever. You don't want to make your life harder than it needs to be. And I've done that plenty of times, where I've written a script that had a really good concept, but I didn't execute it properly because I didn't spend enough time figuring out the structure and the outline. That is the downside to the vomit draft. I still like that technique because I just enjoy writing, and I like to be able to kind of solve the mystery on my own. As insane as that sounds, obviously you're solving it yourself one way or another, but it's just more fun to write the first draft without really knowing what's going to happen. Again, I still think you want to really figure things out as much as possible. I've written scripts where I didn't do an outline at all and just jumped right into it. And several of those scripts I never did a second draft of because it didn't deserve a second draft. The concept itself isn't worth my time to go back and try to make those scripts better. Case in point, Extinction Island. I can give you 3 guesses as to what that movie's about. So yeah, it's just sometimes the script is not worth going back and doing another draft. And those ones, I'm glad that I didn't spend a bunch of time outlining. But yeah, as far as this secret project that Connor and I have been working on, which hopefully we'll be able to talk about very soon, could have used a lot more outlining beforehand, and we sort of fell into that trap of just jumping into the vomit draft with a fairly big idea. See, that's the other important key detail is some of those scripts that I was talking about where I was able to really nail it on the first draft. As obvious as it sounds, the reason for that often is that the story was just easier. You know, sometimes it's more contained, sometimes it's about something that you know more about. If I were to try to write like an ER script or something like that, I would have to do quite a bit of research before just jumping into it because I know that I don't know anything about that world. But if I'm writing a horror movie that takes place on Thanksgiving and the entire thing takes place in one house, I have enough life experience to write that because we've all been to plenty of Thanksgivings where family drama occurred, people said things they shouldn't say, things happened that shouldn't have happened, and then on top of that, all I'm doing is just turning it into a genre flick. That was the script Blood Orange that I wrote, and day one of writing that with not much of an outline, if any, I wrote 57 pages, and then finished it over the next 2 days. I believe it was, in fact, Thanksgiving. But anyway, getting back to the idea of outlining, and I've talked a little bit about outlining already, and it's always worth talking about, but yeah, I've had scripts that I wrote no outline for. I've had scripts that I came up with like a 1-page outline, and then I have scripts that I wrote 10 to 20 pages of ideas, you know, not just the outline of all the events that I wanted to take place, but I would also come up with quotes for each of the character that could maybe get into the script somewhere, but more importantly would just kind of keep their voice in the back of my head before writing, so that anytime I'm writing a scene, I go, is this what they would say? And kind of go back to that quote, which sort of encapsulates that character, and go, no, that's not quite what they would say, or yes, that does sound like their voice. So that's some of the stuff that you can get out of outlining that can be very helpful, but at the end of the day, no matter how much effort you put into outlining your script, you're still going to need to go back and redraft. So learning the best way to do that is always going to be in your best interest. And I think there's a lot of key points that can help you get better at redrafting, but at the end of the day, no piece of advice has ever helped me more than the one I came up with myself. If you can't solve a problem, see if your other problems can.